No one expected this. For decades, the United States and Mexico had maintained a carefully managed trade balance in agriculture. Despite political tensions, tariff disputes, and leadership changes, the flow of produce never truly stopped. Tomatoes, in particular, were a cornerstone of that silent agreement, nearly $3 billion worth of them crossing the border every year, feeding American supermarkets and supply chains without question. Until now. In a move that stunned Washington and blindsided U.S. farmers and distributors, Mexico abruptly shifted its tomato exports, valued at over $2.8 billion, away from the American market and toward Canada. What began as a quiet adjustment in trade routes quickly escalated into a full-scale realignment, one that exposed just how fragile the U.S.-Mexico agricultural partnership had become. The reasons, on paper, appeared bureaucratic. New inspections, quotas, delays at the border. But behind the scenes, frustration had been building for years. Mexican producers had grown weary of what they called inconsistent U.S. trade enforcement, politically motivated tariffs, and what they saw as a growing hostility toward Latin American exporters. Canada, by contrast, had spent the past 5 years modernizing its ports, relaxing import policies, and building stronger diplomatic ties with Mexican agricultural syndicates. It was a slow, deliberate courtship, and when the opportunity came to pivot away from the United States, Mexico took it. For American consumers, the impact was immediate. Prices for tomatoes surged in grocery stores across the country, and shortages began to appear in states that had long relied on steady imports from the South. In restaurants and food chains, tomato-based products, salsas, sauces, even ketchup, began costing more or disappearing from menus. But the real shock came further up the supply chain. Warehouses built to handle Mexican produce stood empty. Trucking routes were disrupted. Processing plants idled. And workers, many of whom had spent their lives in the logistics and food service industries, faced layoffs and uncertainty. What had once seemed like a minor supply adjustment had evolved into a cascading economic disruption. At the federal level, lawmakers scrambled to contain the damage. Emergency talks were held with Mexican officials. Press conferences were called. But the answers were vague, the timelines unclear. Mexico, it seemed, had made its decision, and wasn't looking back. Canada, meanwhile, welcomed the new arrangement with open arms. Major grocery chains signed long-term supply deals. Cold storage facilities expanded. And in key trade hubs like Toronto and Vancouver, Mexican tomatoes arrived by the ton, fresh, uninterrupted, and tariff-free. For the United States, the strategic implications were deeper than most realized. This wasn't just about produce. It was about trust. For years, American trade policy had taken its partners for granted, imposing penalties, rewriting terms, threatening walkaways. Now, one of those partners had walked away first. And the timing couldn't have been worse. With domestic agriculture already under strain, from droughts, supply chain instability, and rising operational costs, the loss of a cornerstone import was not just inconvenient. It was a warning. Industry experts began asking hard questions. If Mexico could realign its exports this quickly, what would happen if other sectors followed? Could avocados be next? Or bell peppers? Or berries? How much of the American food system was built on assumptions that no longer held? And if Mexico found greater economic stability and political consistency working with Canada, what would that mean for future cooperation with the U.S.? In towns across the Southwest, where tomato distribution was once a mainstay of local economies, warehouses grew quiet. Forklifts idled. The silence said everything. Something had shifted, not just in trade, but in confidence. In reliability. In the future. And still, this is only the beginning. The fallout didn't stop at tomatoes. Within weeks of Mexico's strategic shift, murmurs spread across Latin America. If Mexico could pull away from the U.S. so decisively, why not others? Guatemala, Honduras, Peru, countries that had long depended on U.S. buyers began quietly exploring alternative markets. Canada, Europe, and even China stepped in to fill the void, offering better logistics, fewer restrictions, and, perhaps most importantly, more respect. The U.S., once seen as the immovable anchor of the Western Hemisphere's trade architecture, suddenly looked vulnerable. Its southern border, once a gateway for economic interdependence, was becoming a bottleneck. Trucks filled with perishable produce waited longer. Inspections grew more invasive. Trust eroded. Meanwhile, in Canada, something remarkable was happening. The shift from a regional agricultural middleman to a continental food trade hub accelerated. Ports in British Columbia and Quebec were expanded. Customs processes were streamlined. Canadian grocers began cutting deals directly with Latin American growers, eliminating U.S. brokers entirely. What used to pass through the U.S. was now bypassing it altogether. The symbolism didn't go unnoticed. American trade officials watched as Canada, their traditional junior partner, stepped into a role the U.S. had long taken for granted. It wasn't just about tomatoes anymore. It was about tomatoes today, then berries tomorrow, then beef, seafood, coffee, cacao. The model was fracturing. Domestically, American farmers, already battered by climate instability and rising costs, felt abandoned. Many had relied on predictable trade flows to justify planting cycles and maintain financial solvency. Now, they were seeing perishable goods rot in distribution centers as cheaper. Foreign alternatives found their way north without them. Even worse, some U.S. agricultural exporters, particularly in Florida and California, reported Mexican buyers backing out of contracts mid-season, opting instead for Canadian partners who promised longer commitments and friendlier terms. This wasn't just a supply problem. It was a shift in gravitational pull. In Washington, the response was fragmented. Some called for tariffs. Others blamed immigration policy. A few suggested tightening NAFTA's replacement, the USMCA. But none of these measures addressed the core issue: the perception, increasingly shared by America's neighbors, that the United States was no longer a reliable or stable trade partner. For Mexico, the decision was both economic and political. Years of erratic U.S. policy, from sudden border closures to retaliatory tariffs, had created deep resentment. The tipping point wasn't just one inspection policy or one renegotiation. It was death by 1,000 slides. And while U.S. media focused on the economic losses, Mexican outlets told a different story. Editorials praised the country's newfound trade sovereignty. Politicians celebrated improved bargaining power. Economists forecast long-term benefits from diversification. For many Mexicans, the shift away from the U.S. wasn't just inevitable, it was overdue. Canada, for its part, remained cautious in tone but aggressive in execution. Government trade envoys toured Latin America with proposals. Logistics companies fast-tracked bilingual hiring programs. Canadian food retailers offered infrastructure assistance to farms in Sinaloa and Baja California. While the U.S. debated, Canada delivered. The ripple effects soon reached Washington's foreign policy circles. If the U.S. couldn't maintain economic influence over its closest neighbors, how could it expect to contain geopolitical rivals abroad? Could trade collapse at home be the first domino in a broader erosion of American influence? Even defense analysts took note. If critical food imports rerouted permanently through Canada, what would happen during a supply chain shock or a future global crisis? Would the U.S. have to rely on Canadian diplomacy to access basic food staples? These were no longer speculative questions. They were increasingly grounded in real, measurable shifts: trucks rerouted, ports expanded, trade agreements rewritten. The $2.8 billion tomato pivot had become a symbol. A symbol of departure. Of distrust. Of decline. And still, this is only the beginning. In private meetings behind closed doors, U.S. agricultural lobbyists began ringing the alarm bells. Not just because of lost revenue, but because of a much more existential threat: irrelevance. If Latin America could shift away from the U.S. once, what would stop them from doing it again? And if Canada could become the primary broker between southern growers and northern consumers, what value would American middlemen provide at all? What no one wanted to say aloud was now being discussed in whispers. America's role in the hemisphere's agricultural supply chain was no longer guaranteed. Back in Ottawa, Canadian trade ministers quietly signed long-term contracts with major produce cooperatives in Mexico and Central America. Warehouses were being built. Cold chain infrastructure was being reinforced. High-speed rail discussions with Pacific ports resurfaced. And while the U.S. debated whether this was a temporary rift or a permanent shift, Canada acted as if it already knew the answer. But the economic tremors weren't contained to produce alone. American supermarket chains, desperate to compete with rising Canadian retailers, found themselves locked out of critical supplier relationships. Some U.S. grocery buyers even attempted to operate through Canadian subsidiaries, just to access tomatoes at a competitive price. It was a humiliating reversal. What once flowed effortlessly through American channels now required cross-border detours and bureaucratic gymnastics. The financial sector took notice. Investment banks downgraded forecasts for U.S. agriculture-linked logistics. Freight companies revised quarterly outlooks downward. The ports of Los Angeles and Laredo, once bustling with southbound produce, saw volume dips not witnessed in over a decade. And still, the average American consumer had no idea what was coming. Prices edged upward, slowly at first. A 12% increase here, a 17% markup there. By the time the media caught on, many lower-income families were already feeling the strain. In food deserts across the U.S., the absence of fresh tomatoes wasn't an abstraction, it was an empty shelf. Or a substitute from a domestic greenhouse, twice the price, half the flavor. Political polarization only made things worse. Some blamed Mexico for betrayal. Others blamed Trump-era policies or Biden's failure to mend relations. Few were willing to admit the uncomfortable truth: the U.S. had overplayed its hand for too long. The world had changed while America assumed it never would. In Mexico, confidence surged. The peso stabilized. Regional economies near trade hubs experienced a modest boom. And perhaps most significantly, Canada and Mexico discovered something neither had expected: they didn't need the U.S. to sustain a high-value agricultural trade corridor. All they needed was consistency, investment, and political will. Now, a new map was being drawn. A map that connected southern growers to northern shelves, without a Washington detour. The North American free trade flow was being reshaped in real time, not by treaties but by trucks and containers, by invoices and contracts. Washington, meanwhile, struggled to respond. By the time congressional hearings were called, the deals were already signed. By the time new subsidies were proposed, the crops were already spoken for. And by the time the public fully realized the extent of the shift, it was far too late to reverse it. This wasn't just the end of a trade pattern. This was the end of an era. And this is only the beginning.